There's nothing quite like an expensive cut of meat expertly prepared and served hot to your table. Before you head out for a costly dinner, check out this worst-to-first ranking of some of the major U.S. steakhouse chains to make sure your money will be well spent. If you're craving a delicious steak, stay far away from Bonanza Steakhouse. This chain tries to combine the best attributes of a traditional steakhouse and a buffet restaurant, but instead you get high-end steakhouse prices at discount buffet quality. Bonanza Steakhouse also serves a wide array of seafood, chicken, and other American favorites that generally underwhelm. If you have to order off of the menu, order anything but the steak, which is the worst of the worst. The best value at this steakhouse is actually their salad bar. Bonanza Steakhouse and Ponderosa Steakhouse are both owned by the same parent company, so do yourself a favor and avoid both.
We come adorable, husband, because the steaks are delicious. Tender, juicy, and cooked just the way you like them. They're great!
No, they're not.
When you first walk into Claim Jumper, it looks like a great choice. This national steakhouse chain, which dates back to 1977, has a fun Western theme that's centered on the California gold rush of the mid-1800s. During those times, a claim jumper was someone who wrongfully occupied someone else's property, usually with the hope of finding gold. Today, if you make the mistake of going to Claim Jumper, you too will feel like you've been robbed. Despite the fun vibes and interesting furnishings, the food is forgettable. No matter what you order off of the menu, you won't be pleased. Even if you think you'll enjoy Claim Jumper's Western theme, just watch a Western movie instead, and then head to a steakhouse that is worthy of your money. With more than 700 locations in the United States, there's a good chance that you've been to an Outback Steakhouse. Unfortunately, that also means there's a good chance that you've been disappointed. Not only is Outback Steakhouse way too expensive for what you get compared to other restaurants of the same caliber, but the quality of the meat never lives up to what you see on the commercials.
In a perfect world, I would be eating at Chili's constantly, but tonight, there's no rules, just right. Outback Steakhouse.
Outback Steakhouse is primarily known for its Australian theme. If you buy into the hype, you'd think that this restaurant chain serves authentic food that Australians eat while they're tossing around boomerangs and boxing kangaroos. But it's clear from the very American offerings that the founders had never traveled to the land down under prior to opening their first location. The food you'll get at Logan's Roadhouse isn't too different from the offerings at Outback Steakhouse. The main difference is you get slightly more bang for your buck at Logan's Roadhouse, without the fake Australian shtick. That said, Logan's Roadhouse is far from an elite steakhouse. You can find tender ribs here, and the margarita cheesecake is legitimately great, but the steaks leave a lot to be desired. The flavor is lacking, and the texture is iffy at best. One cool thing about Logan's Roadhouse is that the restaurant gives you a bucket of peanuts at your table. Sadly, following multiple lawsuits related to slipping on peanut shells, some locations no longer allow you to throw the peanut shells on the floor, diminishing the restaurant's casual charm. Now there's nothing to distract you from the boring food. With locations all over the world, Wolfgang's Steakhouse is truly international, but if you're in the US, you'll have to find one in New York, New Jersey, or Hawaii. Is it worth it? While the steak at Wolfgang's is a lot better than the steak you find at most casual steakhouses, it's not quite good enough to justify the price tag of about $50 per steak. While the ribeye steak is very flavorful, it's just not notable enough to be worth the money. The high prices would be easier to digest if it weren't for the fact that Wolfgang's Steakhouses can get uncomfortable and loud. This is not the place to go if you're trying to have an in-depth conversation with a date. Also, don't get confused and think that this steakhouse is the brainchild of Wolfgang Puck. This chain comes from a man named Wolfgang Zwiener, and while Mr. Zwiener has more than 40 years of experience in the industry, the confusion caused by the name of the restaurant resulted in a lawsuit. Saltgrass Steakhouse is basically the opposite of Wolfgang's Steakhouse, both in good ways and bad ways, offering an extremely comfortable dining experience with friendly, attentive waiters, relatively low prices, and an impressive assortment of appetizers and desserts. Unfortunately, the quality of the steaks at Saltgrass Steakhouse just isn't there. The restaurant covers all its steaks with a flood of garlic butter, and while that's a tasty gimmick the first time or two you have it, eventually you'll realize that the wool is being pulled over your eyes. Beneath the butter is a steak that lacks the flavor or the satisfying texture to survive on its own. If you want to go to a saltgrass steakhouse, you won't have much luck on either the East Coast or the West Coast, but you can find this steakhouse throughout the heartland if you look hard enough. Charlie Palmer Steak has locations from the Golden State to the Big Apple, all of them luxurious. But unless you know exactly what you're doing, you're not guaranteed to be satisfied by your meal. For starters, you need to know that the seafood at Charlie Palmer Steak is actually better than their steak. Their yellowfin tuna tartare, citrus-marinated wild Baja prawns, pan-roasted sea bass, and halibut are all great choices. If you do go with their steak, be sure you add a sauce like horseradish cream, blue cheese fondue, or roasted garlic jus. Otherwise, if you order a steak without any sauce, you'll be met with a piece of meat that looks really good but lacks flavor. Morton's The Steakhouse claims to have the best steak anywhere, and at one point in time, that may have been true. However, these days, you're taking a gamble. Sometimes the steaks are outstanding, but other times, they're so rubbery that you'll have a difficult time swallowing. Unfortunately, the prices are the same no matter what you end up with. If you're headed to Morton's The Steakhouse, order the filet mignon, which it offers in 3 different sizes, starting at 6 ounces. If you're lucky, you'll get an amazing steak that you will talk about for the rest of the week. But if you get a steak that has a rubbery texture, all you can do is eat as much as you can and take the rest home for your dog. Fido will be thrilled. Black Rock Bar and Grill is an interesting concept, and while this place is unlikely to become your favorite steakhouse, it's unique enough that you should try it at least once in your life. At Black Rock, your meat is served on a volcanic rock that's been heated to 755 degrees. It's a novel idea, but not the strangest thing a steak has been served on.
What is that thing?
These are roof tile.
Wow. Me.
Once you're given your slab of sizzling meat, you're in charge of the rest of the cooking. The best part of the experience is that every bite of steak promises to be as hot and as juicy as your initial bite. On the other hand, if you wanted to cook your own food, wouldn't you have just gone to your kitchen instead? Black Rock Bar and Grill isn't a place to kick back, relax, and get lost in conversation. It promises to be a memorable dinner, but you'll be responsible for most of the heavy lifting. With only 8 far-flung locations, Shula Steakhouse stretches the definition of national chain, but it's worth mentioning nonetheless. Shula's is the creation of legendary Miami Dolphins head coach Don Shula. You might think that a football coach knows a thing or two about filling up hungry people who love to eat, and you'd be right. While this steakhouse offers a fine dining experience, the portions are large, and the steaks are worth the money you'll spend. If you go to Shula's with a big appetite, order the 48-ounce porterhouse, and there's no way you'll leave without feeling stuffed. What holds this steakhouse back is the lack of quality options on the menu. While the steaks are really good, the seafood is mediocre, the appetizers are a letdown, and even the cocktails manage to underwhelm. If you like your steak to be bleeding, Stony River is the place to go. In fact, Stony River doesn't recommend ordering their steak medium well or above. While this may be disappointing for those who prefer to see no pink in their steak, it's a godsend for those who daydream about digging into a rare slab of meat. Stony River has more than a dozen locations spread across Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, Michigan, Missouri, North Carolina, and Tennessee. But it's worth a trip if you can gather up a group of like-minded carnivores who enjoy rare meat. Don't go here if you want to order seafood or salads, as you'll be disappointed. Stick to what Stony River does best. Texas Roadhouse is what would happen if Outback Steakhouse traded in its Australian theme for Texas and actually prioritized the flavor of its food. It even has a better version of Outback's iconic bloomin' onion, the cactus blossom. Texas Roadhouse is definitely a casual steakhouse with casual steakhouse prices, but don't think the laid-back atmosphere means the steaks will disappoint. Far from it. In fact, their steaks are much better than you might expect considering their fairly low prices. The tenderness of the Dallas filet is worth the trip, and if you want something unique, try the Roadkill. While the name isn't the most appetizing, this steak is covered with jack cheese, mushrooms, and onions that have been roasted to perfection. Texas Roadhouse is an especially good steakhouse option if you're going with a family, as the kids menu will satisfy even the pickiest of eaters. With locations in all but one of the 50 states, you can likely find a Texas Roadhouse near you. Smith & Wollensky has only 7 locations in the US, so get ready for a drive, because it's a fancy steakhouse that isn't afraid to spice things up. While their standard ribeye isn't spectacular, their Cajun-marinated USDA prime dry-aged bone-in ribeye is definitely worth ordering. This steak is very flavorful, but if you don't enjoy spicy foods, you should probably skip it. It's a little bit on the pricey side, but if you are looking for something more affordable but equally as fun, there's always the lunch menu. Mastro's Restaurants is a marvelous steakhouse where you need to either go big or go home. Don't order the normal steaks on the menu. They're all above average, but not worth writing home about. If you're at Mastro's and you have a few $100s burning a hole in your pocket, you owe it to yourself to try one of the Japanese A5 Wagyu steaks. Sure, you'll spend a whole lot of money, but your taste buds will agree that it is well worth the hit to your wallet. If you've never eaten A5 Wagyu, you should know that this is some of the highest quality meat on earth. Beware though that you might not be able to go back to regular steak again. Mastro's Restaurants also have a lot of seafood options on the menu, but you'd be wise to stay away because these dishes aren't good enough to justify the inflated price tag. Make sure you adhere to their strict dress code too. If you want a fine dining steakhouse experience but don't want to have to break the bank, Del Frisco's Double Eagle Steakhouse is a great place to go. Everything about this steakhouse is fancy, from the decor to the wine list. While all their steaks are worth ordering at least once, it's the 45-day dry-aged prime ribeye that steals the show. It's not cheap, but this is a steak that is well worth the money. The amount of flavor packed into one slab of meat is over the top. Even better, you can also order the seafood from Del Frisco's Double Eagle Steakhouse with confidence. Their salmon and sea bass dishes are particularly outstanding. The only issue with this steakhouse is the lack of tasty sides. The best side is the creamed spinach with bacon, cheddar cheese, eggs, and mushroom. All their other sides, while fancy, are well below average. While Fleming's Prime Steakhouse and Wine Bar is operated by the same company that owns Outback Steakhouse, you'd never know it. The two restaurant chains are worlds apart. The menu at Fleming's is so thorough that it can be overwhelming, but you can't really go wrong. Be sure to start off with one of their great appetizers, like the sweet chili calamari or the seared pork belly. And then be sure that you end it with a triple-layered chocolate caramel cake, or any of their other scrumptious desserts. While other steakhouses offer a wider variety of steaks, all of Fleming's steaks are really good. They may be more expensive than more casual steakhouses, but the quality of their steaks means you're actually getting a pretty good deal. Go with the filet mignon if you're having a hard time making a choice, especially if you like your steak medium rare. It's only 6 ounces, but delicious. Of all the casual steakhouse chains in the country, Longhorn Steakhouse reigns supreme with 600 locations. At this restaurant, you get high-end steakhouse quality at casual steakhouse prices. The 14-ounce Delmonico is one of the best steaks you can find anywhere. Longhorn Steakhouse expertly trims the steak, adds its one-of-a-kind seasoning, and then grills it over a fire. The result is stupendous. If you love rare steak, go with a rare Delmonico and your life may be changed forever. Whether you're coming here for lunch or dinner, this restaurant has menu options that are sure to excite and entice. Of their appetizers, the Wild West shrimp is fun and tasty. And although many steakhouses have chocolate lava cakes, the lava cake at Longhorn Steakhouse is better than anything the competition can offer.
What is a Chris Steakhouse? Is that a type of a steakhouse? What sort of a steakhouse do you got there? Oh, it's a Chris.
Ruth's Chris Steakhouse has a well-deserved reputation for having spectacular food. They have the art of serving gloriously flavorful steaks down to a science. If you're looking to impress, Ruth's Chris Steakhouse will always get the job done. Of all the steaks there, the cowboy ribeye is the one that stands apart from the rest, even if you typically don't like bone-in steaks. This majestic steak is 22 ounces of USDA prime-cut ribeye that will keep you riveted. If you are in the mood for some surf and turf, you can't go wrong with the petite filet and shrimp. This Ruth's Chris Steakhouse specialty comes with half a dozen large shrimp and a pair of ultra-tender medallions. The lobster is also well worth your hard-earned money. The Capitol Grill is a lot like Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, but with a more ambitiously robust menu. No matter which meal you select, you'll walk out of this steakhouse satisfied. The porcini rubbed bone-in ribeye is a mouthful just to order, but it's well worth the twisting of your tongue, popping with a unique flavor that everyone should taste at least once in their life. Their dry-aged steaks are some of the best you will ever eat. Of any steakhouse on this list, the Capitol Grill also has the best seafood. The seared salmon melts in your mouth, while the lobster cakes will cause you to fantasize about the next time you'll visit this steakhouse. The Palm has just under 20 locations, one of them in an airport, but every location is still number 1 on this list. While it's nearly impossible to escape this steakhouse without spending at least a couple $100, splurging at the Palm will never leave you feeling an ounce of regret. The food is so good that it will feel like a bargain. Of all the steaks there, it's the filet mignon that is the cream of the crop. At the Palm, it's the quality of the meat that makes all the difference. Their beef is fed only corn, selected by an expert to make sure only the best of the best makes it into the restaurant, and is aged at least 35 days. After that long process, the result is a steak that blows all other steaks out of the water. The Palm also serves outstanding lamb and perfect seafood, and its starters are all very good. Add in an extensive wine list and exquisite cocktails, and this is the place where you'll want to celebrate all of your life's special moments.
The history of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse is as colorful and eccentric as the city where it was born. There's plenty about this venerable restaurant that even its most loyal customers probably don't know about. So keep watching to discover the truth about Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. Ruth Fertel was a divorced single mother working as a lab technician at Tulane School of Medicine in New Orleans when she became interested in buying a local restaurant specializing in steaks. Despite having no restaurant experience, in 1965, she took out a $22,000 mortgage on her house in order to buy Chris Steakhouse. Fertel was so inexperienced that when she met with the bank, she only asked for the $18,000 to purchase the restaurant. Luckily, the bank made sure that she borrowed a few extra thousand to cover food and overhead costs. Despite her lack of experience, her new venture became an immediate success thanks to her determination. In one interview, she described the type of service that customers could expect. As she noted, "We went out of our way to please customers. We spoiled them. One of our regular Sunday customers was operated on for his teeth and couldn't bite into a steak, so I chopped his steak in the grinder, formed it into the same shape as before, and served it to him. He was thrilled."
Ruth welcomed everyone, from hardworking folks to elected officials on the take.
When Chris Steakhouse burned down in 1976, Ruth Fertel quickly scrambled to open it back up in a new, bigger location. That presented a problem, though, as her original purchase agreement with the previous owner specified that she could only use the restaurant's name at the original location. So to work around this dilemma, Fertel simply tacked her own first name in front of the original moniker, resulting in the unwieldy Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. As her son Randy recalled in his memoir, The Gorilla Man and the Empress of Steak, she had grown to hate being called Chris, or worse, being taken for Chris's wife. The new name's oddness made it both memorable and a bit of a tongue twister. One restaurant critic once likened it to a sobriety test, as anyone who could say it correctly was probably not inebriated. Even though Fertel came up with the name, she wasn't particularly fond of it. As she told Fortune magazine in 1998, "I've always hated the name, but we've always managed to work around it."
And work around it she did.
On her first day as owner of what would become Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, Ruth Fertel sold 35 steaks, charging about $5 for each one. Within 6 months, she had raked in more than twice her annual salary at Tulane. As the restaurant's reputation grew, so did its clientele. After one of its most loyal customers moved from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, he would occasionally return just to get a steak at his favorite restaurant. In 1977, he talked Fertel into opening a Ruth's Chris franchise in his neck of the woods, so that he'd be able to enjoy her steaks without having to make the long drive. As Fertel once explained, "When I started franchising, that really got the name out. And the more the name became known, the busier we became in all our restaurants. Our name recognition spread. In fact, all our franchisees were people who had eaten at one time or another in one of our restaurants. We never looked for franchisees. They came to us." As of 2021, there are more than 150 Ruth's Chris Steakhouse franchises around the world. When putting together her staff, Ruth Fertel bucked tradition and hired other single mothers as her waiters. She and the other ladies came to be known as the Broads on Broad Street, referring to the restaurant's original New Orleans location on North Broad Street. Fertel knew from her own experience that raising a child on one's own required both reliability and hard work. So radical was her hiring practice that there was a time when Ruth's Chris was the city's only upscale eatery to have female servers. Even after Fertel's passing in 2002, her restaurants have continued to celebrate mothers. For example, in 2017, Ruth's Chris announced a special Mother's Day menu and a gift for moms. As chairman and CEO Michael O'Donnell declared, our founder, Ruth Fertel, was a single mother and famously employed an all-female waitstaff of single mothers at our first location in New Orleans. We are proud to raise a glass to her and all mothers, past and present, on this special occasion and provide a small token of our appreciation for their hard work and devotion. Whenever a steak is served at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, it's still sizzling when it arrives at the table. This dates back to the original Chris Steakhouse practice of placing the plated steak under the broiler for a minute or so and then adding a pat of butter and some parsley, as the butter creates the signature sizzle. It's no mean feat to ensure that the steaks are still sizzling and popping when they make it to the table. So Ruth Fertel came up with a solution to ensure that it happens. A custom-made infrared broiler that cooks the steaks at an enormously high temperature. As Lana Duke, a franchisee of Ruth's Chris restaurants in San Antonio and Toronto, told Dine magazine in 2020, with her chemistry and physics degrees, she had this broiler made that cooks steaks at 1800 degrees. The sizzle in the plate kept it hot to the very last bite. It was difficult to get every Ruth's Chris in the world to do that. If it doesn't sizzle, send it back. That helped build the brand. With such serious commitment to the sizzle, it's no wonder that Ruth's Chris has hung around for so long. Along with those sizzling steaks, another signature dish at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse is the creamed spinach. Ruth Fertel never revealed where she obtained the recipe while she was alive, though her son Randy did tell New Orleans Music Magazine, Offbeat, that the dish was his great-uncle's invention. As he recalled, the story of the spinach, it's an old family recipe. In my research, I went to interview a cousin in Houston, and we were driving along to see another cousin. And I said something about how everybody loves the creamed spinach at Ruth's Chris, and she said, "You know, that's Uncle Martin's creamed spinach." Randy believed that it would have been a great idea to tell diners that the recipe was a treasured family recipe, but his mother saw things differently. He chalked her secretiveness up to her pride. As he explained, "I think it was all about my mother's ego. She wasn't going to share the fact that it wasn't her recipe."
Dang, I thought y'all had steak.
Oh, we do, on the second page of your menus.
If you haven't been eating at Ruth's Chris for every decade that it's been open, you might not realize that the restaurant made the switch from dry-aged to wet-aged steaks, as Randy Fertel revealed in his memoir. His mother did this to maintain more consistency. Dry aging presents some disadvantages, like the additional cost of cold storage along with a certain degree of loss, which results in the meat becoming more expensive in the long run. Another problem with dry-aged beef was spoilage. As Randy recalled, Mom weekly lost a few steaks to such taint when customers turned up their noses. While Fertel would quickly get the customers a replacement steak, she also believed that the whole experience gave the restaurant a bad reputation for those customers. So she decided to switch to wet-aged steaks, which are aged after being vacuum-packed in plastic and don't go bad. However, while wet-aged beef may deliver more consistency, it tends not to be as robustly flavored as dry-aged meat. In 2005, New Orleans was devastated by Hurricane Katrina, and Ruth's Chris Steakhouse was one of many businesses affected by the fallout. The flagship location on Broad Street was badly damaged by the floodwaters, and it never reopened. The chain's corporate offices, which were located in the New Orleans suburbs of Metairie, were also flooded, which led to a big change. Ruth's Chris executives got together for a meeting to figure out their next move, and they ultimately determined that the situation in New Orleans was simply too tenuous. Thus, they decided to move the company's corporate headquarters to Orlando, Florida, as chief executive Craig S. Miller told the New York Times. "It was probably one of the toughest decisions that I ever had to make, to tell my people that we are not going back." One of the most beloved aspects of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse is its reputation for promotional offerings, such as giving moms a $25 credit on Mother's Day. One particularly notable promotion occurred in 2019 at a Ruth's Chris location in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that promised a free steak to anyone with the name Chris, or a variation such as Christopher or Christina. Specifically, they would receive a free 8-ounce petite filet. As Paul Hanna, the restaurant's general manager, announced, "We have loved bringing this excellent steakhouse legacy to the Ann Arbor community for over 5 years, and we'd like to thank the community once again for their continued support. This summertime promotion is a fun and unique way for us to pay it forward." Another Ruth's Chris promotion offered a special gift to the class of 2019. All 9 of the restaurant's North Carolina locations honored graduates by offering them a complimentary 3-course dinner from the seasonal classics menu. The expectation was that graduates would be dining with their families, as the offer was contingent on the purchase of an additional 4 adult entrees. In the spring of 2020, Congress passed a $2 trillion stimulus package to address the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Included in the package was the Paycheck Protection Program, a $349 billion fund administered by the Small Business Administration, intended to provide low-interest loans for small businesses with fewer than 500 employees. Alas, 2 weeks after its April 3 launch, the PPP had completely run out of money. It soon became apparent that some not-so-small businesses exploited a loophole, with large corporations able to collect loans if those companies had fewer than 500 employees in one of their locations. Ruth's Hospitality Group, corporate parent of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, was one of those companies, as it received 2 $10 million loans for 2 of its properties. Outrage erupted in light of the fact that Ruth's Chris had made $42 million in profit on $468 million in revenue in 2019. Furthermore, the company had $86 million on hand in cash reserves. It also didn't help that Ruth's Chris had furloughed a significant number of employees. Meanwhile, numerous independently owned restaurants throughout the country were unable to get a dime in loans when the PPP fund ran out. Eventually, a Change.org petition was launched, demanding that the corporate owners of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse return their loans. As the petition stated, many small businesses are now being told there is no money left for them, and they cannot pay their employees and may have to close forever. This is a travesty and a disgusting display of corporate greed during a time of disaster. Soon after its launch, the petition received more than 250,000 signatures, and on April 23, 2020, Ruth's Chris Steakhouse announced that it would return the $20 million in loans. But it wasn't all bad press for Ruth's Chris during the pandemic, as one location in Granger, Indiana, offered free meals to its laid-off staffers and their families once per day on weekdays via curbside delivery. Ashley Kiles, one of the laid-off employees, told WNDU News, "I always knew that I did work for great people and a great establishment, but unfortunately, when hard times happen, they happen. And here we are, and they are standing right by my side, letting me know that everything is going to be okay."
When this whole tragedy hit, the first thing we thought of is what is going to happen to our 75 employees.
The rift in quality between a great steak and a bad steak is perhaps greater than any other food. Just as the best can make your day, so too can the worst totally ruin it. These are some of the most famous cuts of steak, ranked from worst to best.
What does steak mean?
Pardon?
What does steak mean?
This is steak.
Some cuts of steak are better than others, sure, but they almost all have their uses, and there aren't many to totally avoid. Then again, there's the beef round, a large primal cut of beef, mainly coming from the rear leg and rump. It's made of 3 parts: the top, tip, and bottom. The top round is the most tender part, but that's not saying much. It tends to be extremely tough and lean. Many people use it for thin sliced roast beef. As a steak, it's next to useless. The tip, also known as a sirloin tip, is a lean, boneless cut best for kebabs or stews. Its connective tissue makes it chewy and gross unless it's braised. Finally, there's the bottom round, which includes the eye of round, which the Splendid Table once called, quote, one of the few unredeemable cuts of meat. Near tasteless, tougher than John Wick, and not worth your money. Skirt steak comes from the plate, which is the muscle inside the chest and below the ribs. There's an inside and outside skirt, but they're not that different from each other. You're most likely to come across an inside steak at the grocery store. Skirt does have a few things going for it. It's genuinely quite flavorful, but like the round, it's still best cut into thin slices. This is because it's a very tough, muscle-heavy cut, so overcooking it by the slightest amount is going to make you very unhappy. Try to keep it rare or medium rare. The skirt's long shape makes it unwieldy to prepare and season, and a total nightmare to fit into all but the largest pans. It's best served in thin slices, but be warned, a novice cook might be tempted to cut it with the grain, which seems more natural. That's a great way to completely ruin an already average cut of beef. The flank steak comes from the underside of the cow, a little further back than the skirt, behind the plate. It's very similar to skirt steak too, with flank steak being slightly less tough. That said, flank steak does still tend to be tougher than many other cuts. You're generally not going to want to cook flank as a steak unless you intend to serve it as thin slices, but they do at least marinate nicely. And remember to cut against the grain. We can't really tell you which to go for if you've got a choice between flank steak or skirt steak. It probably depends on whether you prize taste over tenderness or vice versa, but there's really not a whole lot of difference between the two. The sirloin is generally divided into 3 smaller cuts: the top sirloin, the bottom sirloin, and the rear part of the tenderloin. These different parts vary wildly in quality, tenderness, and flavor. By and large, the bottom sirloin is the worst of the 3. This cut is actually great for roasting, but it's not great for turning into steaks unless you slice it and marinate it. Even then, it's going to be chewy, especially compared to the top sirloin. Certain parts of the bottom sirloin, such as the tri-tip, bull tip, or flap steak, are good for kebabs and stews.
Whoa. There's still plenty of meat on that bone. Now you take this home, throw it in a pot, add some broth, a potato. Baby, you got a stew going.
The strip steak is a cut of meat that comes from the short loin, which is located in the top center of the cow's body, just in front of the sirloin. It's what remains once you take the tenderloin away from the short loin. Serve them together and you've got a T-bone or porterhouse. If you're after a middle ground between tender and tough, this is probably the steak for you. It's got a little chew to it without being a nightmare to eat. It's also great for flavor and moisture thanks to the marbling. Sadly, however, this marbling does mean strip steak can be a little on the pricey side, and it's debatable whether that extra cost is really worth it, especially compared to some of the other cuts of comparable price. You can sometimes find bone-in strip steaks, which are otherwise known as shell steaks or club steaks, and these versions pack some extra flavor. Always worth considering, but again, expect to pay a little more for the privilege. The vacío is a really popular steak in Argentina. It's a primal cut of the flank, but it's quite different from a flank steak. The vacío hangs beneath the loin and is bolstered by the cow's belly, which encases the meat in layers of fat. When butchered, the vacío steak has an unusual diamond shape, weighs between 4 and 5 pounds, and can feed a good-sized party of meat lovers. It's always slow-grilled whole, then sliced, and the well-marbled meat is tender and very flavorful. The crispy belly fat is almost as cherished as the steak itself. In France, this cut is called the bavette d'agneau. It's the exact same cut, but as you might expect, cooked in the French way. It's cut into individual steaks and is either marinated and grilled or pan-fried in butter, then served with a shallot sauce and French fries. Next time you're sipping wine in a French bistro and see steak frites on the menu, order it and enjoy a steak loved on 2 continents. The top sirloin comes from the upper portion of the sirloin and is usually presented in the form of a tender, boneless steak. It may not be the most tender cut of beef, especially compared to some of the pricier cuts, but it's not too tough, and careful cooking can keep it from becoming too chewy.
What you got there, top sirloins?
Yeah, New York's are grain-fed.
3 times the omega-3s and grass-fed.
Bought and paid for.
Well, you're going to want them aged if they're top sirloins.
The great thing here is that top sirloin is hugely flavorful and often marbled nicely. It's also fairly lean, making it a little healthier than its rival cuts. The best thing top sirloin has going for it is that it's great value for money. You're unlikely to have to shell out as much cash as you would for a ribeye or T-bone, for example, but you're going to get a much better steak than other cheaper options, such as the round or bottom sirloin. It's also versatile, being as suitable to a stroganoff or a kebab as it is a steak. A T-bone is cut from the forward section of the short loin and contains both a strip of top loin and a nice big slab of tenderloin. It's a great combination of the texture and flavor of those two cuts in one impressively sized chunk of beef. The strip steak has got all the flavor, and the tenderloin has got an amazing texture. With the T-bone, you get to experience both at once.
T-bone steak. For lunch? Well, I am just a T-bone kind of guy. Love that T-bone!
There are two downsides to T-bones, though. One, they're usually crazy expensive, partly because they combine two prized cuts of beef, and partly because they seem to have become so popular in high-end restaurants. Second, they lack some of the versatility of tenderloin alone, which can be used in a number of different ways. But if you're hankering for a real steak lover's steak, you can probably do no better. Also known as butler's steak or boneless top chuck steak, flat iron steak is a relatively modern cut of beef. According to Kansas City Steaks, flat iron steak comes from the shoulder region or top blade. The meat is full of rich, juicy marbling and is incredibly tender, but had long been considered unusable because of a very tough sinew. Omaha Steaks has reported that researchers at the University of Nebraska and the University of Florida actually conducted a scientific study to figure out how to best use this piece of meat, ultimately determining that if you sliced the meat off at either side of that tough sinew, you'd be left with an intensely flavorful and highly affordable cut. Many chefs consider the flavor and texture of flat iron steaks similar to more popular and pricey cuts like filet mignon. They're inherently smaller pieces of meat, so you may not want flat iron for a Sunday feast, but it's great for an affordable weeknight dinner. To all but the most discerning eye, the porterhouse steak is pretty much the exact same cut of steak as the T-bone. The main difference is that the porterhouse is a little thicker and contains more of the tenderloin. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the tenderloin fillet has to measure at least 1.25 inches from the bone to the edge, or it's not a porterhouse. Why does the porterhouse steak come out ahead of the T-bone? Simple, it's bigger. That may sound ridiculous, but this is steak we're talking about here. Bigger is better. There's a reason people call it the king of T-bones. The hanger steak is cut from the short plate, on the underside of the cow, and is a neighbor to the skirt steak. It's absolutely chock full of flavor, and because the muscle it comes from does little work, it's incredibly tender too. Hanger is also extremely easy to cook and takes much less effort to prepare compared to some of the other lesser-known cuts of beef. It's pretty cheap too because so few people seek it out. It was actually once known as butcher's steak because butchers used to keep it for themselves. The only problem, really, is that hanger steak can be difficult to get a hold of. Only one cut of hanger can be taken from each animal, so it's difficult to produce widely. As Chef John Elwood tells MyRecipes.com, for a grocery store to sell 10 hanger steaks, they would need to buy 10 cows. This would not only take up a disproportionate amount of storage space, it would also require having to sell thousands of pounds of beef just to secure 10 hanger steaks. Now we're in the big leagues. The tenderloin is cut from the short loin of the cow and contains very little connective tissue. The result is an incredibly tender cut of beef that's the source of some of the finest steaks in the world. Take filet mignon, for example. This steak is cut from the end of the tenderloin and is often regarded as some of the best meat you'll find on a cow. It's tender beyond all belief. And though it lacks little in flavor compared to its other expensive brethren, it's suitable for all kinds of cooking and pairs beautifully with bacon.
The young lady wants a filet mignon. You know, little hunk of meat, little pink on the inside.
You might argue that because a T-bone or porterhouse steak contains tenderloin and some strip steak on the side, those cuts are superior. But encumbered by its strip companion, the tenderloin becomes incredibly versatile. For example, tenderloin is the cut of beef used in the preparation of steak tartare, thanks to its lack of gristle. It can also be used to make carpaccio, a delicious Italian appetizer. Or you could fry it up with a little butter and have it as a steak. The ribeye is naturally taken from the rib of the cow and is easily one of the most prized and sought-after cuts of steak. To gauge the quality of ribeye, take a gander at that marbling. These cuts are practically covered in it, and the flavor itself is just as impressive. All that extra fat imbues the steak with an incredible amount of flavor, making for one of the tastiest cuts. It also helps that they're extremely juicy, wonderfully soft, and exactly as tender as you could ever want your steak to be. Unlike tenderloin cuts, you've also got size on your side. A ribeye should easily fill the belly of even the most ravenous steak lover. And one of the most prized types of beef in the world is a ribeye cut, Kobe. It's a ribeye cut from the Tajima strain of cattle raised in Hyogo, Japan. Real Kobe is the perfect encapsulation of all that is right with the ribeye cut, as tender as it is tasty. Ribeye steak is just the best there is.
Steak looks like simple fare, just a lump of cow exposed to high heat. But steak can be tough or just underwhelming if you don't treat it right. And it's more complicated than you might think. You've probably messed it up somehow in the past, but that's alright. We'll fix that now, and let you know what mistakes to avoid if you want to eat like royalty. There are lots of things that can go wrong to ruin your steak dinner. You can undercook the steak, overcook the steak, underseason it, overseason it, have a few too many drinks and forget about it entirely, the list goes on. But don't worry about all that just yet. In order to eat a good steak, you first have to buy a good steak. While it's easy to empty your wallet on the more fashionable cuts like sirloin, ribeye, and filet, with a little knowledge, you'll find that other bits of the cow come with delicious flavor but not the premium price tag. So if you want steak but struggle with the price, instead of those classic but expensive cuts, try throwing a hanger steak, a tri-tip, or short rib on the grill. Since they are likely to have more connective tissue or naturally be a little tougher, they may require a little more attention to cook just right, but if you make the effort, you definitely won't be sorry. When giving a choice between lean and fatty, most people will err on the side of lean. This is understandable if you're looking to cut calories, but otherwise you're probably better off buying a smaller, fattier piece of meat. This is because the fat often adds flavor and juiciness to the steak, especially when the fat is marbled throughout. Good marbling is an indicator of high-quality meat, and it is one of the things USDA inspectors look at when deciding on the rating. An even distribution of fine marbling is the best choice, and will earn the meat a USDA rating of prime for the best cuts. Those are so high on the scale, they're the ones sold in hotels and fancy restaurants. But the choice label meats is still a pretty decent piece of meat. Finally, there's select, which are leaner cuts that have a little less flavor. If you go below select, you're getting into generic store-brand plastic wrap meats. And although they offer financial advantages for the budget-conscious consumer, you'll probably incur net flavor losses if you go this route.
So as it cooks, this fat just imparts more and more flavor. It just melts in your mouth. Delicious.
While the USDA rating system is an easy shortcut to choosing a great piece of cow, there is really no substitute for years of experience to help you get the most for your money. That isn't to say you should struggle through years of hit-and-miss meals before you earn that experience for yourself. Although supermarkets and plastic wrap meat are convenient, there are other places you can go for your meat where good advice is included in the price per pound. Expert advice is invaluable, and good places to go for that are butcher shops, farmers markets, or the occasional supermarket with an actual in-house butcher, not just a local teenager wearing a bloody apron. The advice they can provide goes beyond the immediate questions like flavor and price, and can include information on the origin of the meat. That way, you can go home actually knowing what you're about to throw on the fire, rather than accepting the prepackaged fiction that can hide a whole host of culinary and ethical sins. With many of the other animal products that you probably have in your refrigerator or freezer, you'll typically want to get them to room temperature before you cook them. When it comes to steak, though, having the meat start out on the cold side will work in your favor. Here's an example of just why this is so important. The internal temperature of a rare steak is around 125 degrees. So if you're cooking it from room temperature, say 72 degrees, the grill only needs to raise the internal temperature 53 degrees to hit that mark. But if you leave your steak in the fridge at around 35 degrees and throw it on the grill at that temperature, the grill now has to raise the inside temperature 90 degrees to get to the same place. The extra time required to heat the steak to the ideal temperature makes it easier for you to hit the window of perfect doneness. And it also gives the outside a little extra time for the Maillard reaction to take effect. That's the complicated chemical reaction that will get you that nice exterior char and produce that mouth-watering grilled flavor you're totally thinking about right now. This goes for frozen steaks too. Cooking steaks straight from frozen is better than thawing them before cooking because it results in more retained moisture and less overcooking. There are two ways your steak gets wet. It either comes out of the package covered in the natural glistening steak runoff comprised of myoglobin and water, or you decide to rinse it under the tap. Rinsing any meat is just a bad idea because while you think you're removing harmful bacteria and making the world a safer place, you're actually spreading it around your kitchen and into places you'll never think to hose down with bleach. Since you won't be rinsing your meat anymore, there's just the myoglobin left to consider, and those juices that look so much like blood aren't really a problem. However, if they're on the steak when you throw it on the grill, they'll get in the way of the Maillard reaction. The Maillard reaction really gets going around 300 degrees, which is easily achieved by most any grill. However, if the surface of your steak is wet when you start to cook it, the temperature of the steak will plateau at 212 degrees until the water boils off, and only then can it heat above the 300-degree threshold required for exquisite flavor to appear. But since the steak is also cooking while it's sitting at 212 degrees boiling off water, there won't be much time left for making flavor when it finally dries itself out. Give your steak a few good blots with a paper towel before cooking to ensure this isn't a problem. It goes without saying that you should season your steaks before you cook them, but are you seasoning them enough? Maybe you give them a light sprinkling and call it good. You'll find that although the light sprinkling seemed like just the right amount on the surface of the meat, it totally failed to take into account the iceberg nature of steaks in general. Most of the meat is below the surface. When you season your steak, you should apply a generous helping of kosher salt and pepper and rub it into the surface. You can't really go wrong with salt and pepper, and it's a completely legitimate way to start. If you're feeling adventurous though, you can take it much further. There are endless recipes for steak rubs and marinades to get your mouth watering. But a simple one to start with is made simply by adding garlic powder and onion powder to salt and pepper. Be warned that using exotic rubs and marinades might overpower the more subtle flavor of the meat, but that might be a good thing. If you only have access to a so-so cut, a sneaky rub might make all the difference to your meal. You're cooking a couple of classy steaks that cost you most of a day's wages, so you're going to do it right and cook them in some equally classy extra virgin olive oil, right? Wrong. Extra virgin olive oil might be the best choice for a lot of cooking, but it isn't cut out for the heat. Throw it on a nice salad and it's right at home. But throw it on a grill at 500 degrees and it will cut and run and leave bad flavors in its wake. Extra virgin olive oil has a low smoke point of around 320 degrees, and butter is a bit higher around 350 degrees. If you use either of these or any other oil with a similar smoke point, the oil will start smoking. Apart from the aforementioned bad flavors the oil will leave behind, the smoke may contain toxic chemicals. Better choices for grilling or frying steak include peanut oil, canola oil, and extra light olive oil, all of which have smoke points of above 400 degrees. Choosing the right oil will help you make tastier steaks, and when you fry steaks inside in the middle of winter, you won't turn your house into a really big meat smoker. Common wisdom would have you fling the steak on the grill or in the pan and flip it once halfway through the cooking time. And it would be hard to make a claim that this method doesn't work because a million tasty steaks have been cooked this exact way. But just because it works doesn't mean it's the best way. This method is trying to prevent unnecessarily removing the steak from the heat because it needs all the searing hot fire it can get during its brief time on the grill. However, extra flipping might be just what the doctor ordered, if the doctor was invited to dinner. Frequently flipping the steak actually helps it cook more evenly. The brief period of cooling lets excess heat escape and prevents the meat near the surface from overcooking. And it also helps the meat cook faster because although there is a small amount of heat loss, the temperature doesn't get down far enough for the cooking process to stop. Thus, flipping about every 30 seconds effectively cooks the meat from both sides at once and can shorten cooking times. Don't worry, this technique doesn't change the flavor much from the single flip method. Look at it this way: if you're engaged in a particularly interesting conversation, or if you would rather give your attention to a certain dinner guest than a charring hunk of meat, you won't harm your reputation by reverting. But if you want faster food or just an excuse to stop talking to a dinner guest for a few minutes, start flipping. If you've ever had a conversation about steak, you've probably heard of the poke test. According to this method, you can tell whether a steak is rare or well done simply by poking the steak with your finger and comparing its squishiness with different parts of your hand or face or whatever. The additional benefit of this method is that you avoid puncturing the steak with a meat thermometer and releasing the juices. There are two things immediately wrong with this. First, the difference in temperature between a medium rare steak and a rare steak is less than 10 degrees. If you can accurately tell the difference between the two by touch, please go on one of those reality TV shows that showcases weird talent. Second, a steak is not a water balloon. Sure, poking it with a meat thermometer will release some juice, but unless you've already severely messed up and cooked the steak virtually dry, the amount of liquid lost won't be noticeable to anyone who isn't mechanically designed to measure such things. The only real and honest way for an average, non-professional steak flinger to accurately distinguish the differences is with a decent meat thermometer. Besides, a meat thermometer looks totally pro, and your guests actually don't want you poking their food with your fingers just before you slap it on their plates.
Danny, how you cooked yours? Medium. Good man. So, touch it.
Steak is pretty awesome, and you can't be blamed for wanting to immediately shove it down your throat once it's off the heat. This is a mistake. As meat is cooked, the fibers start to shrink, and any water they contain is squeezed out and into the spaces between. The higher the temperature the meat achieves, the greater the effect. If you cut into the meat immediately after it comes off the grill, much of that liquid will run out onto your plate. However, if you cover the meat in foil and let it rest for 10 to 15 minutes, the fibers in the meat will have a chance to relax and let some of the juices back in. And here's one final word of advice. You should relax too. Cooking a quality steak can be a stressful experience for you as well as the steak. What with all the heat, spitting oils, charring meat, and short cook times. So if you don't give yourself a chance to chill and enjoy the process, you will have turned the chance to eat like royalty into nothing more than a medieval chef simulator. You may know how to cook the perfect steak, but there's still a good chance you believe at least some of the most pervasive steak cooking myths out there. These are the common myths about steak that are actually false. One aspect of eating a steak that can really turn some non-red meat lovers off is the pinkish red liquid that oozes out of a juicy steak. It can be unsettling because yes, it does kind of look like blood. In fact, we often call a very rare steak bloody.
How do you want that cooked? Burnt to a crisp or bloody as hell? Bloody as hell.
However, you won't find blood even in the rarest of steaks. The liquid coming out of a cooked steak is actually called myoglobin, and it's a protein in animal tissue. Myoglobin serves to deliver oxygen to the muscles of an animal. Luckily for every steak lover out there, it's safe to eat and doesn't have anything to do with blood. The myoglobin in a steak will darken as it's cooked, which is why a rare steak looks a lot bloodier than a more well-done steak. All that juiciness is part of what makes a well-cooked steak so enjoyable, so embrace it. We've all heard it for years. Eating meat that's too raw or rare is dangerous.
This steak is completely raw. What kind of sick, twisted restaurant is this?
In many cases, this is true. You certainly wouldn't want to eat chicken or turkey that's still pink in the middle for risk of getting sick. And it is important to make sure meat and animal products are heated to a certain temperature before consuming. But eating a rare steak, while it can pose some health risks, is not quite as dangerous as consuming other types and cuts of rare meat. The majority of the bacteria that can make you sick from raw meat is on the surface of the meat itself, which is why most cooks don't want pink in the middle ground beef. Grinding the meat can introduce bacteria into the whole of the product. On the other hand, a steak doesn't have that problem, as most of the bacteria will remain on the surface. If you want just about any meat to be more flavorful, it's a good idea to salt it before you start cooking it. Most people know this, yet the myth that it's bad to salt your steak before cooking is still pervasive. However, there's generally not a lot of information about exactly why steak should supposedly be salt-free before it hits the skillet or the grill. Perhaps that's because there's no good reason not to salt your steak. Not only does the salt bring out more flavor from the meat, but salt is also important for a process called dry brining. Generally speaking, it's best practice to salt your steak about 40 minutes to 2 hours before you're ready to start cooking it. If you forget to plan ahead, you can also sprinkle some salt onto the steak right before you put it in the pan. One mistake you don't wait to make though, salting your steak 5 to 10 minutes before you start cooking. At that point, the salt will have brought the moisture to the surface of the steak, but it won't have had enough time to dry out. It seems to be common knowledge in the kitchen that there's a specific number of times you're allowed to flip a steak.
Just say it out loud. One time.
No good cook would dare to flip a steak more than once, right? Turns out that's a myth. Flipping a steak multiple times can actually prevent it from drying out too much. There's also less of a chance that the meat will end up being overdone on one side or the other. But if that's the case, where did this myth even come from? Perhaps it's because many cooks want that beautiful crosshatch pattern on their slab of meat, in which case flipping only once is essential. But as chef and food celebrity Samin Nosrat notes in her Netflix special, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, those pretty crosshatches you see on steaks and TV and commercials may look good, but they actually probably don't taste as good as a steak that's been cooked more evenly.
They're all about the grill marks and the perfect 90-degree crosshatches. Those people are missing out on flavor, because browning is flavor.
This myth makes a lot of sense at first glance. The reasoning behind it is this: sticking a fork in your steak before it's on your plate only lets the juices run out of it, juices you want to be sealed inside. Yes, of course, you might lose some of those juices when you stick a fork in it, but it's not going to make a difference when it comes to taste or tenderness. Want to flip your steak with a fork? It may not be conventional, but we don't judge, and it's not going to ruin your steak. Not only is stabbing your steak with a fork before you sit down to eat not a sin, but you may even want to take it a step further. While you can never truly know if your steak is fully cooked without using a meat thermometer, checking the color of the inside of your steak by cutting it open can give you an idea of how long you need to leave it on the heat. It may not result in the prettiest, most flawless steak, but it can help amateurs get a feel for how to cook a steak specifically to their liking. Everyone seems to have an opinion about the best cut of meat to get if you want a top quality steak. But filet is always a top choice. Some, in fact, believe it's the only kind of steak you should even bother with.
This is a $54 steak.
Oh, congratulations. It looks really good.
Yes, it does.
But if you adopt this attitude, you're going to miss out on a lot of variety and some amazing culinary experiences. Filet is more tender than other cuts, which is a big bonus. But cuts like ribeye or a sirloin are going to offer a fattier, richer taste since they have more fat marbling. The benefits of branching out and trying different cuts of meat is manifold. First of all, filet is the most expensive kind of steak, so if you opt for something different from time to time, you may save some cash.
When you're young, it's all fillet steak, but as the years go by, you have to move on to the cheaper cuts.
If you're passing up the grill for your skillet when it's time to cook your steak, you may wonder what kind of fat you should be using to sear your piece of meat. Simple oil is a popular choice here, as is butter. These options can be delicious, but they aren't the only options out there. Those who really want to give their steaks a kick of extra flavor might want to opt for an alternative, beef fat.
Wait, the secret ingredient in the beef is beef?
When your pan heats up, you can add a bit of rendered beef fat to the bottom. Just keep in mind that you don't want to use too much fat at the bottom of your pan, or you may end up boiling your steak. Instead, it's possible to simply brush beef fat directly onto your steak. And yes, that tastes just as delicious as it sounds. One very common steak myth is that it's essential to sear a steak as soon as it hits the heat to lock in all the juices that might otherwise escape. The idea behind this is that the seared side of the steak acts as a barrier, creating a barrier on the outside of the steak the juices can't get through. This is a complete myth though, as juices can still easily escape a seared steak. Cooks who truly want that brown, delicious crust on the surface of their steak might want to try a different method. It may sound unconventional, but heating a thick steak gently at first, and then searing it can actually produce better, more delicious results. This is because the cooking element will begin to dry out the steak when it's on low heat, and it also cooks the cut of meat more evenly. By the time you're ready to sear, your steak will be ready to take on that beautiful dark brown color. Not long ago, putting sauce on a steak wasn't the crime that it is today. Catching a glimpse of an A1 steak sauce bottle at a steakhouse wasn't grounds to leave the restaurant entirely. It might even be expected, but times have changed. It's generally accepted that a good steak should under no circumstances find itself smothered with sauce, taking away from the true taste of the meat. Consumers have rejected traditional steak sauces for good reason. These sauces can largely mask the taste of a high-quality steak instead of bringing out its true flavor. But that doesn't mean you should ditch the sauce entirely. An alternative to heavier sauces is a light chimichurri sauce. Chimichurri hails from Uruguay and Argentina, where a beef-heavy diet is common. Rather than covering the taste of steak, a nice chimichurri will highlight all its strengths. Now that's a reason to celebrate.
Come on, I'll buy a steak.
Brazilian steakhouses are popular around the world for their all-you-can-eat meats and rodizio-style dining. If you're a meat lover, a Brazilian steakhouse is a dream. But there's a lot you might not know about the tradition they came from. This is the untold truth of Brazilian steakhouses. The Portuguese word churrasco means barbecue in English and can be used to refer to all kinds of grilled meats. More often, however, churrasco refers to a specific method of Brazilian grilling in which beef is barbecued on a long skewer and served by cutting off individual slices. Brazilian steakhouses use this technique to cook and serve a variety of different meats, from sirloin cap known as picanha to a type of pork loin called lambo. But for Brazilians, churrasco is much more than just a cooking method. Churrasco, like much regional cuisine, defines a culture and a way of life. Brazilians celebrate their homemade barbecue no matter if they're throwing a party or just relaxing with friends and family. Though you may not be able to travel to Brazil to experience the churrasco way of life, traditional Brazilian steakhouses can give you a taste. Most Brazilian steakhouses serve food using a unique method that lies somewhere between buffet and family-style dining. Rodizio, which translates to rotation, requires diners to pay a fixed price for a variety of all-you-can-eat options. Most steakhouses have a salad bar, but the main course is paraded out of the kitchen on large skewers, which servers slice directly onto diners' plates. According to legend, rodizio dining started when a waiter at a restaurant called Churrascaria Matias in the state of Rio Grande do Sul mistakenly brought a meat skewer to a table that didn't order it. Instead of immediately correcting his mistake, the waiter allowed the diner to try the dish anyway, and so a great tradition was born. Rodizio gained popularity in the mid-20th century when restaurants began feeding truck drivers. Truck driving, as a profession, became more common along with the rise of more road construction in Brazil. Because of Brazil's many cattle herds, meat was cheap to buy, and because of the simple churrasco tradition, it was also easy to make. Hungry travelers were eager to get their hands on it when they stopped to rest and refuel. Picanha is the best and most traditional meat available at a Brazilian steakhouse. No true Brazilian barbecue is complete without it. This particular cut of meat is a necessary ingredient if you're looking for a real Brazilian experience. Similar to a sirloin in flavor and texture, picanha is taken from the backside of the cow in the fatty area above the butt. Most US butchers break down this piece of meat into smaller cuts, thus losing the fat cap that gives picanha much of its flavor in the process. It's the fat cap that infuses picanha with a juicy tenderness unrivaled by other cuts of beef. Surprisingly, despite its extraordinary taste, picanha is actually pretty inexpensive. However, it can be hard to find at a grocery store, but your local butcher should have it. As far as how you enjoy this delicious cut of meat, take it from Chef Antonio from Fogo de Chao.
One thing also to remember, if you don't want to be yelled by a Brazilian, make sure you eat the fat with the picanha.
Though the meat on a Brazilian steakhouse menu might not be familiar to outsiders, locals know these dishes well. From picanha to fraldinha, Brazilian meats, especially churrasco style, are some of the best you'll ever have. Some of the most common cuts you'll encounter at a Brazilian steakhouse are picanha, filet mignon, chuleta, and fraldinha. Picanha is the most traditional cut, taken from the top of a cow's rump and seasoned with salt. It gets skewered into a C shape when it cooks over open flames. Though filet mignon is a well-known cut of beef, sometimes you'll find it dressed up in bacon or a parmesan crust. Chuleta is whole cuts of ribeye steak that gets skewered and roasted, and fraldinha is a cut of bottom sirloin that's marbled with fat and served in long flat pieces. If you consider yourself a big carnivore, a Brazilian steakhouse is the place for you. The Brazilian steakhouse experience centers around, well, steak, and lots of it. The popular chain, Fogo de Chao, has been called a meat eater's mecca because it offers all the meat you can eat. And in that sense, it's not unique among Brazilian steakhouses. However, when Dottie Griffith reviewed a Brazilian steakhouse back in 1997, she noted, Americans and Texans are used to all-you-can-eat salad bars, but all-you-can-eat grilled steak and other meats was new at the time. Not for the faint of heart, or vegetarians, a typical Brazilian steakhouse will leave you feeling stuffed to the brim. Sure, you can't eat another bite. Until, of course, a server comes by the table with a new skewer of delicious grilled meat. With so many options to choose from, if you leave the restaurant walking upright, you're doing it wrong. Though you might assume that America's huge portion sizes have prepared you for this moment, Brazilian steakhouses take it to a whole new level. Brace yourself, and more importantly, pace yourself. Churrasco-style grilling was created to show off the pure essence of the meat. Most of the time, churrasco meats are seasoned only with salt before being put on the grill. The skewers are stacked on top of one another with the fattier cuts on top, so the juices drip down and infuse the other meats with flavor. Brazilian barbecue lacks the smoky flavor popular in Texas and the US more broadly because Brazilian gauchos wanted to preserve the basic flavor of their farm-raised beef. Instead of smoking the meat, which alters the taste, they roasted it slowly on skewers until the outer layer was nicely seared and the inside was tender and juicy. Though beef is the most common kind of churrasco meat, Brazilian steakhouses often serve poultry and lamb as well. Unlike beef, these meats usually get a long marinade in a rich sauce before grilled, giving them an extra boost of flavor. Brazilian cowboys, or gauchos, were the first to cook meat Brazilian steakhouse style in the 1800s. The men would spend their days herding cattle and their nights grilling the meat over a fire for their friends and family. They prepared the food the same way it's done now. Simply sprinkle on some salt and slow roast over hot coals. Back in the beginning of churrasco, gauchos dug pits in the ground to build their fires and waited until it was extremely hot before skewering the meat and starting the roasting process. In those days, the men oversaw the meat, from pasture to butcher to spit, while the women gathered the food they had grown in gardens and prepared side dishes. The meal was a family effort and a celebration. The gauchos and their families gathered around the fire together, similar to the way you might gather with family and friends around the table to enjoy the same Brazilian meats. What are the best things to eat at a Brazilian steakhouse? We consulted with the chef and some notable experts in the Brazilian steakhouse dining world and got their advice on the best ways to spend your calories. Here's what to eat and what not to eat at a Brazilian steakhouse. Jean Delgado, the executive chef at Toro Toro in Miami, said, "When anyone thinks of a Brazilian steakhouse, the first thing they think of is picanha. If you're not overly familiar with picanha, it's the crescent-shaped cut with the fat cap that's become the iconic image of radicchio and the quintessential cut to get when you go. According to Steak School, the cut is taken from the cow's backside, also called the rump cap, rump cover, sirloin cap, or occasionally culotte. But the Brazilian steakhouse preparation, with a hint of salt, is called picanha. Chef Delgado told MASH that picanha is best served medium rare to medium to ensure that the fat and juices are all captured in the meat. He added that it's especially important to make sure that the picanha is sliced correctly as well. It should be cut against the grain to ensure the proper texture. The parade of side dishes that come out when you flip your card to green at a Brazilian steakhouse are a carb lover's dream. The waiter gracefully arrives bearing French fries, rice, mashed potatoes, yuca flour, fried polenta, beans, fried bananas, and broccoli and carrots. So you can pretend you're having a balanced, healthy meal. Fly and Dine appropriately calls them, quote, a distraction, and suggests limiting your sides consumption to about 20% of your total intake. The sides are much cheaper, yet still more filling than the steak circling your table, and therefore a far less efficient use of your money and appetite. The other quintessential Brazilian steakhouse menu item isn't even steak, according to Jean Delgado. It's seafood wrapped in pork. The traditional skewers of bacon-wrapped scallops start with fresh sea scallops, are then wrapped with thick slices of cured bacon, and are roasted in the radicchio until the bacon is delightfully crispy. The smoke flavor from the cured meat in the grill, along with the bacon fat, seeps into the savory scallops, creating a unique flavor that's hard to find elsewhere. Chef Delgado says, "People love this classic dish. The mom and pops want to go back just for the bacon-wrapped scallops. They're not the only seafood item that's worth checking out at a Brazilian steakhouse, though. James Hills, author of the food and travel blog Man Tripping, wrote an extensive guide to Brazilian steakhouses. He told MASH that if you see a salmon or lobster in the radicchio, to give it a shot." Advising against ribeye is not to say that Brazilian steakhouses use lesser quality cuts of meat than their American counterparts. In fact, in an interview with Fly and Dine, Enrique Opelhuya, head gaucho at Fogo de Chão in Los Angeles, revealed that the chain uses only 100% Black Angus beef and that Fogo is highly selective about the cuts they pick. He said, "You need naturally tender beef." And ribeye, especially higher quality ribeye, still scores well in the tenderness department and is far higher in fat and flavor than filet mignon, according to Rob Report. But at the end of the day, it's still an American cut and ultimately something you'll find in abundance elsewhere. As you settle in for your festival of meat at a Brazilian steakhouse, you may see your servers gliding around holding long metal skewers of sausage. Many times, this will be Brazilian chorizo, a cured meat sausage that's especially tasty out of the rodizio. According to HuffPost, the Brazilian version is very similar to the original Spanish chorizo, which includes sweet and hot varieties of pork mixed with paprika. Jean Delgado, executive chef at Toro Toro in Miami, said, "If there's one item I love at a Brazilian steakhouse, it's chorizo. I think it's because they rotate it in with their steaks. It's just a great quality." In addition to the chorizo, Delgado also recommends trying the Brazilian brisket sausages if they're being offered. He told MASH that the finely ground brisket is mixed with paprika and garlic that don't overpower the meat, and when it's smoked, it creates a flavor profile unique to this sausage. Filet mignon is often held up as the ultimate cut of steak, a tender, expensive variety that's used interchangeably with caviar and champagne in luxe life hyperbole. According to the Rob Report, this is mostly because the muscle that it comes from, the tenderloin in the lower back, is especially tender because it isn't used much. Katie Flannery, butcher and COO at Flannery Beef, told Rob Report, "They're not doing gymnastics, so filet muscles get almost zero use during the animal's lifetime. That's why it's so tender." Fly and Dine points out that while filets, which are low in fat, are great as 6-ounce or 8-ounce cuts, little pieces of it wrapped in bacon really won't do much for you. When beef ribs come out at a Brazilian steakhouse, it's a little reminiscent of Fred Flintstone getting a slab of brontosaurus meat that's so big it topples his car.
Would you like to try for a case of amnesia, Jumbo? You wouldn't dare.
James Hills described the visual of beef ribs brought to the table as a sight that's just as impressive to the eyes as it is to the stomach. He told Mashed, "Pork ribs, they're nice, but it's mostly bone. Beef ribs coming out on a plate? It's just this giant hunk of meat that's big and juicy and fatty. It's a cool experience." The flavor, Hills said, is equally monumental, with perfectly caramelized edges on the meat, giving the ribs a hint of sweetness. Yes, if you're watching your cholesterol, a chicken breast is often the wiser choice than a big hunk of fatty steak. But if you're watching your cholesterol, why'd you just drop $75 on an all-you-can-eat steak dinner? Opting for the healthier option went out the window the minute you booked a table at a Brazilian steakhouse, and though the chicken may well be tasty and finely prepared, Man Tripping's James Hills says it's kind of a waste. He revealed to Mashed, "I'm reluctant to say in general because everyone is a little different, but if you look at the selections that are out, some are not as prime as others, so I never get chicken. Chicken is not what I'm going to spend my appetite budget on." If there's one universal piece of advice about eating at a Brazilian steakhouse, it's not to fill up at the salad bar. In Zagat's video guide explaining everything people do wrong at a Brazilian steakhouse, before even discussing the steak, Churrascaria Plataforma meat carver Sandro Lorenzi tells everyone not to do it at the buffet. He said of his New York restaurant, "A common mistake people make here is going crazy at the salad bar. They don't save room for the meat." James Hills agreed when talking to Mashed, with a caveat that vegetarians, or those not looking to gorge, can save some money by dining solely at what Brazilian steakhouses refer to as the market or harvest table. But if you're spending $60 a person to enjoy steak, don't get your fill at the salad bar. Hills advised, "Have a little of that stuff, olives or charcuterie, to cut the fat from the steaks, but don't fill up on salad if you're there for a steak." Though beef tends to be the star attraction at a Brazilian steakhouse, it's far from the only thing on the menu. And in addition to stuffing yourself with enough beef to feed an entire preschool class, part of the idea in going is also to try some stuff that's unique to Brazilian cuisine. In its guide to eating at Brazilian steakhouses, Fly and Dine suggests branching out from the stuff you know and delving into some other specialties. Among these is the traditional Brazilian pork loin known as lombo. Fly and Dine describes it as a Parmesan-crusted cut, promising you'll be rewarded for your adventure. Grill Hall, a churrascaria in Maple Grove, Minnesota, delves a little deeper into lombo, saying, "It's a traditional slow-roasted style of pork that is usually seasoned sparingly with salt, garlic, and some other herbs. It's not exclusively served with a Parmesan crust. Sometimes it's covered with other cheeses, or sometimes none at all, but Parmesan is the most common." If you manage to heed our earlier advice and don't immediately spoil your appetite at the salad bar, you may be tempted to pile your plate with the first meats that show up at your table. But while satisfying, this may not be the best idea. In its guide to eating at Brazilian steakhouses, Groupon stresses some patience after you flip your card to green. Steakhouses, the online coupon site says, often save the more expensive and tastier cuts of meat for last. So the juicy picanha and prime rib won't show up until after the flank steak and chicken. If you can hold off a little bit, you'll get the better stuff. The abundance of side dishes at a Brazilian steakhouse can make you feel conflicted. You're spending a lot of money to enjoy the beef, so using valuable stomach space on sides might seem like a waste. At the same time, you also want to try some classic Brazilian dishes that don't come on a stick. James Hills told Mashed that even if you're there for meat, it's worth trying a side or two. And if you've got to try one, he says it's farofa. He shared, "Personally, I don't love it, but it's a fun way to explore another culture." Farofa, according to Rio and Learn, is a toasted yucca flour that's prepared all kinds of ways. It's typically served as a side with meat, rice, or beans, but you may see it served by itself too. Additionally, another common preparation is feijoada, a stew made up of sausage, bacon, and vegetables. Brazilian steakhouse chain Fogo de Chão offers it as part of its menu, and though feijoada will fill you up more, it's also quite the culinary adventure. While most Brazilian steakhouses will have a pretty solid wine list, Man Tripping suggests instead pairing your meat with something more unique to the cuisine. Its guide to Brazilian steakhouses points to the caipirinha, a traditional cocktail made of cachaça, sugar, and lime, as a refreshing, zesty drink that contrasts with the salty, greasy flavors of the steak perfectly. If you're not trying to include alcohol in your meal, you're not limited to tap water and fountain sodas either. Man Tripping suggests trying guarana soda, a Brazilian specialty with a fruity flavor that uses the guarana fruit to keep you out of a meat-induced food coma. Another non-alcoholic option, agua fresca. This is a simple mixture of blended fruit with water and sugar. It's definitely on the sweet side, but this category of beverage gives you lots of booze-free ways to complement your meal. In a traditional steakhouse, drowning your prime filet in steak sauce is a big-time no-no. It might even earn you a not-so-subtle sneer from your waiter if you try, and will definitely infuriate the chef.
I'm extremely disappointed in you. This is a joke to you.
But this is not the case at a Brazilian steakhouse, not because the meat is of inferior quality, but because, according to Chef Gene Delgado, it's not very seasoned. He told Mashed, "You don't see much seasoning, so it's kind of bland." This, however, is easily offset by the abundance of sauces most Brazilian steakhouses offer on the side. Typically, these will include yuca flour and a vinaigrette sauce called a molho à campanha that's a little like a pico de gallo, with red and green peppers instead of tomatoes. According to Insider, the acidic side is meant to cut the fat and complement the meat in the main course, and you're welcome to cover your meat and as little or as much of it as you want. Meat carver Sandro Lorenzi told Zagat, "There is no wrong way to do the toppings. Just do as you like it."
At its very best, steak is absolutely delicious, but it can also be a bit of a nightmare when it's not prepared properly. And if you're not particularly well versed in the wonderful ways of steak, you should definitely expect there to be a bit of a learning curve as you seek out the succulent steak dinner of your dreams. Word of advice? Definitely expect to endure a bit of trial and error before figuring out what kind of steak suits your particular palate. Here's one rookie mistake that's easy enough to avoid. Don't assume you can just grab any old cut of meat, heat it up, and hunker down to enjoy a 5-star meal. No, young grasshopper, that's not the way to get a truly superior cut of steak on that dinner plate. But don't be intimidated. After trying a few different kinds of steak, you'll start to discover whether you like it to be a little bit on the fatty side or even a bit lean. Hey, perhaps you even like a bit of chew. And who are we to judge? First, selecting the cut of steak is highly important. And make no mistake, there's quite a lot of options out there, from the sublime tastiness of ribeye steak to a few other cuts that are perhaps best avoided. Honestly, the amount of options out there can be rather overwhelming, and an untrained eye won't know what's first-rate and what should be relegated to the trash bin. Meanwhile, some cuts of steak receive endless heaps of praise, while others turn out to be rather underrated at the end of the day. And do you want to know the most underrated cut of which we speak? Of course you do. According to Thrillist, it's hanger steak, an extremely delicious cut from the short plate under the rib of the cow. Highly popular among chefs, many foodies have discussed its relative obscurity despite how very tasty it is. For example, William DeMarco, the corporate executive chef of Las Vegas's Crush and Le Cave Wine and Food Hideaway, had this to say. You have the tenderness of the filet and the flavor of the New York. It's also known as the butcher steak because the butchers used to keep it for themselves rather than sell it. Jesse Schenker of Two Spring agreed, claiming that the most underrated cut is hanger because it hangs close to all the organs and all the blood, which gives it a lot of flavor and richness. That's not to say every chef is quite so gung-ho about hanger steak. For example, David Guaz of Bayou Bakery says, "It's been hanging around every bistro for far too long." Kay Kavanaugh of Western Daughters Butcher Shop also thinks the cut isn't all it's cracked up to be. Here's how she describes hanger steaks. Comprising only about 1.5 pounds of a 900-pound steer, this cut, while delicious, is best served infrequently and only bought from your local butcher shop. Well, we absolutely love hanger steak and think it's truly underrated. But there are certainly some other underappreciated cuts that are worth giving a try. David Guas personally feels that tri-tip is the true king of the neglected bits of beef. Here's what he has to say about this delicious triangular bottom sirloin cut. It is probably the least expensive, best taste of beef you can purchase. There's not a lot of connective tissue, so it cooks very quickly and easily. It has been my go-to meat for grilling. It has a way of soaking in the wonderful flavors and allowed a slight caramelization on the outside. Steve McHugh of Cured evidently agrees, and he also offers a wonderfully simple grilling tip that will truly bring out the best of the cut, along with a wine recommendation. Serve it with a good marinade and cook to medium rare on the grill, and you have a nice sliceable steak to pair with a little chimichurri and a good Malbec. But what do you think? We strongly advise giving each of these recommendations a try, and pretty soon you'll find out exactly what kind of steak you like.
You like steak?
I do. I deliver steak. Do you?
Good steak.
Why does one cut of steak cost so much more than the other? Do things like tenderness, lack of fat, and marbling really make a difference? Keep watching to learn the real difference between cheap and expensive steak. The most expensive cuts of meat are expensive because the meat is tender. And there are only a few cuts of beef that are naturally tender right off the cow. Tenderloin, New York strip, T-bone, and ribeye are the 4 most naturally tender cuts of beef. They're also the ones you'll pay more for at the supermarket. You can also make meat that isn't naturally tender into something that comes pretty close to a tenderloin, just by how you cook it. There are a number of smart pre-tenderizing strategies that work great on almost any cut of beef. Cooks Illustrated suggests soaking your beef for 15 minutes in a mixture of baking soda and water. You can also tenderize your steak with a meat mallet, which helps break apart those connective tissues so the meat becomes less chewy and falls apart in your mouth after cooking. Naturally tender cuts of beef are what everyone wants when they have too much money and someone they want to impress. But the tenderness of the beef isn't the only thing that makes these cuts so expensive. If the whole cow was tender, you wouldn't have to pay more for any particular cut of beef. But according to Prime Steakhouses, the reality is that tender cuts only make up about 8% of the cow. The rest of the meat is so inferior that the butcher has to raise the price of the tender cuts just to make up for what the store isn't making on the rest of the animal. So basically, when there's a limited supply of something, you can expect to pay a lot more for it. Cheap steak contains a lot of connective tissue. Now, that tissue isn't always bad, and you'll actually find 2 different types in beef. According to the U.S. Wellness Meats, collagen is present in cuts like brisket and top round, which are popular for braising or pot roasts. Kitchen reports that collagen is actually good for these cuts because it breaks down with heat. Slow cooking helps give these cuts an extra tender quality. The other kind of connective tissue is elastin. You'll find elastin in the animal's ligaments, which means it shows up in the cuts of meat that come from the active parts of the animal, such as the legs and haunches. Unlike collagen, elastin doesn't break down when you cook it. You have to cut it off if you want to rid your steak of those chewy, inedible bits, popularly known as gristle. There's a good reason why some cuts of meat are tender and some are not: the anatomy of the cow. Similarly, anatomy is also the reason why you get both white meat and dark meat on a chicken. The dark meat comes from parts of the chicken that get longer, more sustained workouts, like the legs and thigh. The white meat comes from parts of the chicken used for short bursts of activity, like the breast muscle. In cows, the most expensive cuts of meat come from the loin. According to S. Clyde Weaver, the muscles in this part of the cow aren't weight-bearing and contain less connective tissue, which makes them more tender. On the flip side, the parts of the cow that get the most use have more of the aforementioned connective tissue. Those cuts are therefore much less tender than the cuts that come from the lesser used parts of the animal. Since the concept of mass production was born, the beef industry has taken this idea to heart. Big operations do everything they can to raise a lot of beef and get it to market quickly. To accomplish this, they employ strategies that some might find questionable, like giving their animals hormones so they will grow faster and be slaughtered more quickly. Cattle raised on large factory farms also typically live in crowded conditions, which makes them more likely to be contaminated with dangerous bacteria. To keep microbial disease down, ranchers sometimes give them preventative doses of antibiotics, which some argue makes the beef of lesser quality and perhaps even dangerous. With operations like this, you can get beef at cheaper prices, but you're getting a lesser quality piece of meat for your money and potentially dancing with the E. coli devil. According to Unique Flavors Catering, meat that's produced on factory farms tastes different too. Beef is expensive in a grocery store, and even more so in a restaurant. You might pay $24 for a pound of tenderloin at Safeway, but if you order the same tenderloin at a low-end steakhouse, you'll probably pay at least that much for only a 6-ounce portion. The good news is, you don't have to order tenderloin in order to have a delicious restaurant steak experience. That's because the flavor of the steak you get in a restaurant is more about the skill of the chef than it is the cut of beef. According to Prime 13, a perfectly cooked steak is salted, brought to room temperature, lightly seasoned, and then cooked fast at a high temperature. And it's never served immediately after cooking. When you let the steak rest, that seals in the juices and helps ensure that you won't end up with a dry hunk of chewy unpleasantness next to your baked potato. According to Clover Meadows Beef, the grade of a piece of meat is decided by a U.S. Department of Agriculture inspector. To make this determination, the inspector looks at the marbling in one specific part of the cow, between the 12th and 13th rib. Marbling is the term used to describe those thin, streaky bits of fat that may or may not run through a piece of meat.
What does marbling give you? Incredible flavor, tenderness, and juiciness in every bite.
USDA inspectors put the beef that is most commonly found in grocery stores into one of three categories. A prime cut of beef is considered the highest quality and therefore costs the most. Prime cuts represent only about 2% of what's on the market in America. The next category is choice, which is not quite as good as prime, but is better than the third category, select. Most of the beef available in the US is choice. If you really want to spend a lot of money on steak, look for Wagyu beef. According to Business Insider, this Japanese bred beef is the most expensive in the world, costing you up to $200 a pound. So, if you plan to enjoy a small Wagyu steak with all 4 members of your clan, you can expect to spend about one monthly payment for a new, moderately priced car.
That is pretty sensational.
It liquefied. The minute that I started to chew, it just liquefied.
Why is this particular beef so expensive? Wagyu cattle are a high-endurance breed, meaning they have more fat in their muscles. But that's not all. When Wagyu calves are about 10 months old, they go to a, quote, fattening farm, where they stand around in confined spaces for the next couple of years, eating nothing but carbs and fiber. By the time they're ready to go to slaughter, their bodies are about 50% fat. This is why Wagyu beef has that prized flavor and texture, though it does come at the cost of the cow not being humanely raised. The difference between grass-fed and corn-fed beef is that one had a marginally better life than the other. Grass-fed animals spend more time in the pasture, and they don't spend the last few months of their life in a feedlot getting fattened up. This means that they don't make it to market as quickly as a corn-fed cow. In fact, Consumer Reports says it can take up to an extra year to fatten them up, which brings up the price. Pasture land is also harder to come by than feedlots, contributing to the higher price of grass-fed beef. The North American Meat Institute says grass-fed beef may be healthier in the sense that pasture-raised animals aren't living shoulder to shoulder with other animals during the last months of their life, and are therefore less likely to carry unpleasant bacterial diseases. Marbling is generally what determines whether a cut gets the coveted prime label or is relegated to the lowly select category. Those categories exist because of presumed meat quality, but they still don't explain why you have to pay so much more for prime beef than for select. It's also based on demand. Consumers prefer well-marbled pieces of meat, especially when they have that desirable prime label. Simple economics determines that things that are more desirable have higher price tags. According to Chef Steps, the other, much more practical reason why you spend more money on a marbled piece of beef is that it costs more money to fatten up a cow. Fat cows need more food, and they also need to eat that food for longer periods of time. More food costs more money, and so ranchers have to charge more for the beef in order to recoup those expenses. The truth is that in a flavor taste test between a tenderloin and a sirloin, the latter would probably win. Tenderloin may have a leg up on tenderness, but it is also often milder in flavor than the sirloin. A sirloin has more connective tissue, which makes it a tougher piece of meat. The trade-off is that it has a stronger flavor, which some people prefer over tenderloin. According to Cattlemen's Restaurant, the sirloin comes from just in front of the rear leg of the cow, meaning it's in between a rump and a porterhouse in terms of how much action the muscle sees in a living cow. If you value flavor over tenderness, then this cut is arguably superior. You may wonder if the top sirloin you bought at Costco is somehow inferior. Happily, the answer is no. Probably. According to CNET, most of the beef at Costco is the same grade and quality as the beef at Safeway, just less expensive. Like everything else at Costco, though, you have to buy more of it in order to get those discount prices. One of the drawbacks to buying your beef at Costco is that you may not be able to eat all of it before it goes bad. Costco ultimately works only if you're good at planning and are able to make the best use of what you buy. It's also worth remembering that beef that comes from Costco is kind of, well, mysterious. That's because Costco isn't exactly transparent about where it sources that meat. So if humanely raised beef is one of your priorities, you can't be sure that your Costco purchase checks that box. According to the CDC, mass-produced meat is more likely to contain contaminants like salmonella and E. coli. That's not just because cattle that live in close conditions are more likely to spread these organisms. It's also because the plants that process and package lots of meat are at risk of introducing pathogens into the meat during handling. Even in the store, there are variables that can bring bacteria to meat. Costco beef has been blade tenderized, also called mechanically tenderized, a process that can introduce bacteria into the center of a piece of meat. So if you're a fan of rare steak, in theory, that means you might get sick using blade tenderized stuff.
The CDC says there have been 6 outbreaks of foodborne illness in the past 15 years that can be directly linked to mechanical tenderization.
If you're concerned about things like hormones, antibiotics, and pesticides in your food, you may want to buy only organic beef. Yet, just because it's organic doesn't mean it also falls into either pasture-raised or humanely raised beef categories. In order to earn the organic label, beef cattle do have to have some room to roam, but that doesn't necessarily mean they lead better lives. According to Mike, organic farmers can't give their cattle hormones even when they're sick, so sick cows may end up dying for lack of medical treatment. And that rule about giving them room to roam only applies for around 4 months out of the year, so it's not like organic cattle get to spend a whole lot of time frolicking in pastures. All of this means that organic beef may be healthier, but it's not necessarily better tasting or more humane.
Pretty much anyone can cook a steak, but how many people have truly mastered the art? From rookie mistakes to little-known tips and tricks, here are the mistakes most often made when pan-searing steak. A great steak starts with the right cut of meat, as different steaks will deliver different levels of tenderness and flavor and usually require different cooking times. Generally, the best cuts for pan-searing are tenderloins, hanger steaks, ribeyes, rump steaks, and sirloins. The meat should always be at room temperature before cooking, and it's recommended to pat the surface of the steak to dry it before cooking, as this will help to form a good crust while cooking. And if you really want to nail the perfect seared steak, you might want to consider spending extra on some aged beef. And of course, as any chef will tell you, the more marbling visible on the meat, the better. To prep your steak, you'll want to use a little kosher salt and a dash of butter. Before you get cooking though, it's important to find out how long you'll need to sear the particular cut of meat you've chosen. Once the steak has been left sitting for a good amount of time, about 20 to 30 minutes usually, it's time to get your pan ready. The most important thing here is that the pan is thick-bottomed and good quality. Cast iron is always a good choice. In order to give your steak a nice crust, it's going to have to get very hot indeed. And cast iron pans retain and conduct heat both evenly and efficiently. But make sure you're treating that pan well. As Michael Haas of Angry Barbecue says, cast iron requires maintenance and upkeep, so always make sure your pan is well seasoned with vegetable oil or butter after every use. And don't worry if you can't get your hands on a cast iron pan, as it isn't your only option. A heavy-duty thick frying pan or heavy griddle pan will probably do the job just as well. Oh, and make sure you don't overcrowd the pan, as it will cause the meat to cool off and begin to form juices which might end up steaming your steaks. This is also why it's important to dry your steaks before cooking, as any excess moisture is going to evaporate, cooking your meat in exactly the wrong kind of way. Well-seasoned meat is great meat, but sadly the reverse is also true, as under-seasoning will often ruin a decent cut of steak. Indeed, people often invest so much time in getting a great pan and a beautiful steak that they forget this crucial part of the whole process. Denise Spencer-Walker of the UK Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board recommends seasoning the steak with a little salt up to 2 hours before cooking, and then she advises adding pepper just before cooking. She explains, contrary to popular belief, seasoning a steak with salt ahead of time doesn't draw out the moisture. It actually gives the steak time to absorb the salt, and the meat becomes more evenly seasoned throughout. Start timing your cooking from the moment the steak hits the pan, and try not to lose track of how long it's been in there, especially if you're trying to hit a certain level of doneness. A good rule of thumb, according to Michael Haas, is that a 1-inch thick-cut steak should be flipped after 1 minute and 30 seconds. After that first flip, Haas recommends throwing in a couple of tablespoons of butter and moving it around the steak and pan. This is to add extra flavor and help the steak crust along should you decide to flip it again. If you're avoiding butter, oil is another good option. In this case, you'll probably want to have coated both sides of the steak with a mild oil, such as canola oil. Doing this will help evenly transfer the heat to the steak during cooking, but try to avoid putting oil in the pan itself, as it can easily burn. Then, if you want to, you can still add butter to the pan during cooking, along with garlic cloves and fresh herbs for an even more flavorful twist.
It's juicy and delicious.
Once you set the steak into the pan to sear it, it's important that you don't jiggle the pan or move the steak. You want it to stay put and just let it cook. And while most people know they ought to flip the meat at some point, not everyone knows that it can be beneficial to sear the sides too. As Chef Chris Valdez says, many people forget to cook those sides, which usually have a fatty piece that could use some searing to melt and develop flavor. It's a simple enough process. Just tilt the steak sideways using tongs and allow it to cook for about 2 minutes or until clearly seared, and then repeat the process on every side of the meat. Some people like to season their meat again after it's in the pan, but whether that's really necessary or not is up for debate. Truth is, if you season the meat properly at the onset, you probably don't need to season it again. Also, once you sear the meat, it's very difficult for new seasoning to get past the crust. Then again, it's your dinner, so do what feels right to you and season accordingly. That's what most chefs do anyway. For example, some love adding fresh herbs to the pan during cooking, such as a few sprigs of fresh thyme or rosemary. This is optional but delicious and can create a luxurious pan gravy to add to your finished steak. Fresh herbs added at the beginning of the cooking process may burn before the steak is done though, so if you go fresh, make sure to throw them in towards the end. To build up an even crust on both sides, you'll want to cook the meat for the same amount of time on each side, and some chefs recommend only turning the steak once. Even if you flip twice, it's important that you don't overflip your meat, as it could interrupt the cooking process and ruin your beautiful sear. One other thing you'll want to avoid is flipping too soon. The golden rule here: be patient and stay patient. Let that steak cook and form a crust on the outside before you flip, as doing so too early will cool the pan down and cause you no end of problems. Different chefs tend to have different techniques for cooking to a meat's desired doneness, or even for checking if a steak is done in the first place. But the easiest method, especially if you're first starting it out, is probably to invest in a meat thermometer. As Chef Craig Hansen says, know what the perfect steak looks like for you and know the temperature it needs to be. Then of course, it's all about your personal preference. Do you like your steak rare? Medium? Well done. Rare will have an internal temperature of 120 degrees. Medium rare is about 140 degrees, and well-done steak is 160 degrees or higher. But remember, when cooking, always remove your steak at about the 10-degree mark before your specific temperature, as all steaks will continue cooking after leaving the pan. Letting meat rest before eating it is an essential part of the cooking process that is often missed for completely understandable reasons. After all, people are hungry and steak is delicious. But it's hard to understate just how important resting is and how crucial it is that it never be skipped. Resting lets the juices in the meat redistribute evenly, and that translates to a more balanced and juicy steak. So don't skip out on that super important resting time, no matter how ravenous you might be. Your steak will thank you for it.
So good.
Craig Hansen suggests allowing any type of steak to rest at least 2 minutes prior to serving or slicing, and it's advised to always rest it on a plate or cutting board rather than in the cooking pan, as that would continue cooking the steak and prevent it from actually resting. It might be hard to believe, but as important as knowing how to prepare and cook a steak is, how to cut and serve it is just as important. First, you'll want to make sure to grab a super sharp knife before you get started. After all, you don't want to ruin your steak by ripping it, while the ideal knife and cutting technique will allow you to cut through that meat as if it were butter. Many chefs suggest cutting the steak against the grain, which is almost always the best way to get truly tender, beautiful slices of meat. And you might want to consider slicing the steak right up before serving too. As Chef Craig Hansen says, I always prefer to serve steak sliced. It makes it easier for you and your guests to enjoy without the struggle from a possibly dull steak knife. If you are serving the steaks unsliced, however, they should be transferred to the plate and served right away after the resting process is completed. Any of those resting juices should be poured over the steak or into the accompanying sauce before serving. For an accompaniment, you might want to consider a peppercorn sauce, a béarnaise sauce, a red wine sauce, or a chimichurri. After that, bon appetit!
Omaha Steaks Incorporated advertises that it serves up the best cuts of beef straight from America's heartland. From its humble beginnings up to a huge expansion into new markets, it's not just mail order anymore. This is the untold truth of Omaha Steaks. Believe it or not, Omaha Steaks hasn't always been the meat industry mainstay it is today. The Omaha Steaks story begins not in Omaha, Nebraska, but actually in Latvia during the 19th century. When the Simon family fled Latvia due to fervent anti-Semitism in the country, they eventually wound up in Omaha, where they were among the first Jewish people to make their way into the city. The Simon family patriarch J.J. Simon and his son B.A. worked together as butchers, which was the family trade back in their European homeland, founding the Table Supply Meat Company in downtown Omaha in 1917. The company grew in popularity among local Omahans. The business eventually changed its name to Omaha Steaks in 1966 as the company expanded to sell their product in other states via the Union Pacific Railroad. More than 100 years after Omaha Steaks' beginnings as a company, the food delivery service has grown all across the nation, raking in around $500 million in revenue each year. According to the Omaha Steaks website, the company has become the country's largest direct response marketer of beef and gourmet food. Talk about living out the American dream. In the company's century-long history, Omaha Steaks has remained a Simon family enterprise for generations. The current CEO and owner, Bruce Simon, is the great-great-grandson of Omaha Steaks founder, J.J. Simon. Simon has grown up in the family business and used to accompany his father to the plant as a child before working there during summer breaks from high school and college. This made Bruce Simon a natural choice to step into the position, as he had served various other positions within the company until 1994, when he became president and CEO.
We love customers like you.
Unlike other meat industry giants like Tyson Foods and Oscar Mayer, Omaha Steaks remains a privately owned company, meaning that investors cannot purchase shares of Omaha Steaks. While going public is typically looked at as a huge accomplishment for any major company, remaining a private family-owned business has allowed the company to focus more on its long-term strategies rather than constantly worrying about quarterly earnings. The name Omaha Steaks is admittedly quite a bit misleading. While beef might be what comes to mind when you first hear the company's name, you might be surprised to find that you can actually get a much wider range of specialty products. In the 1960s, Omaha Steaks began expanding its catalog from only offering steaks to also include premium cuts of pork, poultry, and seafood. Since then, they've added an even more extensive range of products to the menu, as the company's delivery services have become much more widespread. While steaks are still the prime cut of meat at Omaha Steaks, you can actually purchase a huge range of products besides their signature beef as well. From Polish-style kielbasa to hearty wild halibut fillets, they've even got an expansive line of side dishes to serve alongside the main course, including charcuterie selections and potato-based side dishes as well as some decadent wines. Ever wonder how Omaha Steaks manages to keep their products fresh even while they're shipping them all the way across the country? Raw meat is not exactly the easiest thing to transport thanks to its tendency to spoil. So how does Omaha do it?
What's colder than dry ice? I don't know.
When the company began its mail-order operations in 1952, they settled on using wax-lined cartons filled with dry ice to keep the meat cool, essentially mimicking a refrigerator. As polystyrene and vacuum packaging became more popular and mainstream, Omaha Steaks ditched the wax-lined containers and began using those, in conjunction with dry ice, as a means of keeping the meat cool. Vacuum packaging ensures that the meat has no exposure to air, and thus bacteria, while the dry ice keeps the temperature down low without requiring any electricity. That means high-quality steaks that haven't gone rancid on you in the mail. Does your dog whine and beg every time you throw a steak on the grill? Next time you stock up on some Omaha Steaks, you might want to consider grabbing some of their signature dog treats, which the company added to their inventory around 17 years ago. As the New York Times reported in 2004, customers were constantly telling the company's management that they were feeding scraps from their Omaha Steaks products to their dogs and cats. Eventually, the company gave in and decided to capitalize on their popularity with pets and began making dog treats themselves in 2003. Now, these pet treats aren't some downgraded, poor-quality meat scraps left over from the higher-quality cuts of meat meant for humans. Omaha Steaks uses the same high-quality beef to make their dog treats, creating a product that actually resembles the company's beef jerky, just with a lot less salt. Omaha Steaks is quite well known for its lavish and pricey boxes of food. Boxes like their gourmet stock-up package, which features filet mignon, sirloin, chicken breast, other meats and side dishes, will cost you a couple of $100s. While these are great deals if you have a lot of mouths to feed, chances are you don't need to be spending that much on some fancy meat that you probably can't get rid of fast enough. That said, Omaha Steaks has plenty of more reasonable packages for the everyday diner. If you're willing to do a little shopping, $20 can actually go a long way over at Omaha Steaks. For starters, it's not hard to find at least a couple of promotional sales on their website. But also, you can typically grab a pack of 8 sausages for around $20. The same goes for certain cuts of beef, like their tenderloin tips. But what's the point of a cheap steak if it doesn't taste any good? As Business Insider reported, the quality of what you get at Omaha Steaks typically surpasses that of what you can find in your local supermarket. If you've got the extra cash to spare and want to go to a local butcher or steakhouse, then of course you can't beat that. But Omaha Steaks might just be the next best thing. Perhaps you've gotten a call or two from a robocaller at Omaha Steaks trying to sell you on their holiday gift box special that's stuffed to the brim with gourmet hamburgers and tri-tips galore. Well, in 2014, one man in Gresham, Oregon had received just one call too many. According to the Oregonian, Michael Hetherington received 10 unwanted calls to his cell phone from the company over the course of a little more than a month in 2013. Hetherington did some research on laws surrounding telemarketing and realized that the company could be breaching the Telephone Consumer Protection Act of 1991. The act essentially states that companies aren't allowed to call customers without their permission or use automated programs to dial up random numbers. There's also an added emphasis in regards to protecting cell phone numbers. This is exactly what Omaha Steaks was doing when they called Hetherington those 10 times, and he filed a lawsuit against them in 2014. The lawsuit grew into a wider class action suit and was eventually settled about 2 years later in 2016, when the company had to shell out $5 million to customers they'd called in violation of the TCPA. According to Top Class Actions, a website investigating various class action suits across the country, customers began receiving checks from Omaha Steaks for around $40 in December 2016. You're probably most familiar with the Omaha Steaks website or maybe even their mail catalogs. After all, the company is primarily known as a delivery service. But Omaha Steaks does have a handful of brick-and-mortar shops across the United States as well. According to the Omaha World Herald, the first Omaha Steaks retail store opened up in the company's hometown in 1976 as a pilot for possible similar operations throughout the country. Prior to opening up shop in downtown Omaha, customers could only purchase Omaha Steaks through the mail or at select restaurants carrying their products. Though it was a pilot project, the company didn't really begin expanding its brick-and-mortar presence beyond Nebraska for nearly a decade. In 1985, the first retail shop outside of the Cornhusker State opened up in Houston, Texas. Since then, Texas has surpassed Nebraska as the state with the most Omaha Steaks locations. The company has since opened up more than 75 locations across the nation, so if you're looking to get your hands on some Omaha Steaks and you need them fast, you may just be able to drive on down to your nearest location to stock up for the next family cookout. According to data from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, Nebraska has a grand total of 6.3 million cattle, meaning that bovines outnumber people in the Cornhusker State by 3 to 1. That's more cattle in the state than there are people in the entire city of Los Angeles. In fact, Nebraska is the state with the second highest cattle-to-people ratio, so you know why they take their beef seriously over there. According to Omaha Steaks, this beef-centric ethos is what's kept them in the state throughout their century-long history.
All Omaha Steaks are grain-fed Midwestern beef from the heart of beef country USA.
The company prides itself on sourcing all of its beef from farms throughout the heartland of the United States and not outsourcing anything from cheaper, faraway locations in South America or Australia. According to the company, all their steak products come from grass-fed, grain-finished beef. Another factor that helps boost the quality of your Omaha Steaks box set. When the COVID-19 outbreak hit the United States, a number of meat processing facilities all across the nation found themselves in the center of controversy. Workers at these plants were considered essential, and as such, many meat processing companies did not shut down their operations. One of the companies at the center of the story has been Tyson Foods, which has been linked to around 4,500 reported COVID-19 cases nationwide. Omaha Steaks didn't have Tyson-sized issues, but the company still had to take plenty of precautions. Per an April 2020 press release, Omaha Steaks continued operations at its facilities, and the company said it would be working to maintain social distancing measures at its facilities while also allowing all staff at its plants paid sick leave. As of May 2020, Omaha Steaks had not been linked to any COVID-19 cases like some of its competition. Although it may seem like a cold and distant corporate entity, at its core, Omaha Steaks still adheres to the mom-and-pop ethos that its founder, J.J. Simon, fostered when he first made his way to the United States. And a big part of that is giving back to the Omaha community. The Simon family maintains close ties to the city, carrying out various acts of service throughout Omaha and its surrounding regions. The most recent example of that, the company's response to the COVID-19 outbreak. According to local news outlets, Omaha witnessed huge spikes in unemployment in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, during the first week of April 2020 alone, more than 25,000 people filed for unemployment in the city. In response, the Omaha Downtown Improvement Group partnered up with local businesses, Omaha Steaks included, to provide meals for a drive-through pantry to help out those who were struggling with unemployment as a result of the crisis. While organizers were initially looking for discounted prices on food to give out, Omaha Steaks reportedly refused to accept a single cent for any of the hamburger or pork chops that the company doled out.
It's hard to go wrong when it comes to ordering at a steakhouse, but make no mistake, whether it's the lackluster flavor or a pure ripoff, all menu items are not created equal. These are some things you should order at a steakhouse, and some that you should skip. A trip to a steakhouse is a luxury experience, and if possible, you should order accordingly.
Let's see, steak. Oh yeah, the Douglas Sirk steaks. Have that.
There won't be anything on the menu more luxurious than Wagyu beef. Wagyu is a Japanese beef cattle breed known for the marbling, or fat, within the meat itself. Most pieces of steak will have most of the fat surrounding it. Wagyu is unique in that it has these streaks of fat within the tissue. This gives the steak an unrivaled level of flavor, richness, and tenderness. Not only is it tastier than other breeds of cattle, Wagyu beef is healthier as well. According to the American Wagyu Association, Wagyu has a higher ratio of healthy to unhealthy fat than other beef and has a minimal impact in raising cholesterol levels. The one downside is that all these great qualities come with a sizable price tag. Any cut of Wagyu beef will likely be the most expensive item on the menu, potentially costing up to and well past $100 for a 12-ounce steak. If you can get your hands on real Kobe beef, by all means, go for it. But that's going to be a taller task than you might imagine. Kobe beef is the meat that comes from one specific breed of the 4 breeds of Wagyu cattle. But outside of Japan, Kobe beef has come to be known as any type of Wagyu beef. That might seem like an insignificant detail, but this breed has a unique genetic makeup, creating unrivaled marbling. In other words, even in the elite class of Wagyu beef, Kobe sits head and shoulders above the rest. So why is the piece of meat at your favorite steakhouse not the Kobe beef the menu says it is? In order for it to be true Kobe beef, it needs to come from a cow raised in a particular area in Japan, in addition to meeting many other criteria. The environment, methods, and expertise required to properly produce this high-quality meat can only be found in Japan. Because of its rarity, Kobe beef is hard to find in America. According to Business Insider, in 2016, there were just 8 restaurants in the country that served the real thing. If you order a faux Kobe beef steak, you'll probably still end up with a pretty good meal, but you certainly won't be getting what you paid for. As the name implies, ribeye steaks come from the rib cage of the animal. They're often cut with the rib bone attached and hold on to a lot of the fat from the bone. The fat in the steak breaks down during the cooking process to both tenderize the meat and make it one of the most flavorful steak cuts you'll find. This cut of meat is often best cooked by pan searing. Because of its high fat content, ribeyes are prone to flare-ups that can occur on the grill. The grill's high heat can also quickly dry out the meat. Cooking it in a pan is a slower process that gives the fat time to break down and tenderize the meat, creating a mouth-watering steak. Personal preference aside, ordering a steak well done is a bad idea. When a steak is overcooked, it loses fat and moisture. The result is a dry, tough piece of meat. New York Magazine restaurant critic Adam Platt puts it best about ordering it well done, saying, "You're just left with a hunk of beef which is burnt and which you put flavorings on. What's the point of it?" If you're eating at a steakhouse, you're dealing with the highest quality steak cuts, which have been expertly cared for each step of the procurement process, and they have a price tag that proves it. But when you overcook a steak, it loses all the flavor that makes it worth the cost. You might as well throw your money down the drain. The ideal doneness for a steak is generally considered medium rare. At this point, the meat is still tender, and the fat has marbled to create a buttery, rich flavor. There may be no more iconic or recognizable cut of meat at your favorite steakhouse than the T-bone.
Of course, I could get a hell of a good look at a T-bone steak by sticking my head up a bull's, but I'd rather take the butcher's word for it.
We've all been to restaurants where we face the dilemma of choosing between two equally appetizing options. This is where the beauty of the T-bone steak comes in. It's actually two steaks in one. The T-bone is cut from the short loin, below the backbone. This area produces some of the most tender cuts of steak. The short loin can be broken down into two steaks, a New York strip and filet mignon. But with the T-bone, these two pieces are kept together, separated by the bone from the name. Both the New York strip and filet mignon are cut from the center portion of the cow, meaning that they're more tender. The strip side has a strong, beefy flavor, while the filet is milder. The bone helps insulate the meat while it's being cooked, allowing the steak to retain moisture and juiciness. There are so many amazing cuts of meat on the menu of an average steakhouse, but one cut you're probably going to want to avoid is the tenderloin. Granted, the tenderloin is one of the most tender cuts of beef available. It's cut from the short loin portion of the cow. Because this area of the cow is not weight-bearing, there's little connective tissue to toughen up the muscle. But texture isn't everything. And what the tenderloin makes up in tenderness, it lacks in flavor. The problem is that this cut is very lean. The absence of fat means the tenderloin will have, at best, a mild flavor. You'll be dependent on a good, heavy sauce to bring life to the dish, at which point you'll be wondering why you paid so much for a steak in the first place. If you're not up for the whole T-bone, stick with the New York strip steak. You'll most often see a New York strip served boneless, but you may have the option to leave the bone in. In this case, when the two cuts of the T-bone are separated, the middle bone is kept attached to the strip.
You get closer to it, the meat is way juicier, way more tender.
The bone helps insulate the beef while it cooks, allowing it to retain moisture and turn into a mouth-wateringly juicy steak. But it's best to wait to visit a steakhouse to try this style of cut rather than throwing one on the backyard grill, as bone-in steaks are much harder to cook than boneless ones. It's best left up to the professionals. There's a strong argument to be made for never ordering chicken at a restaurant.
So here is the chicken you'll be enjoying tonight.
You have this information. This is fantastic.
Absolutely. His name was Colin. Here are his papers.
It's far less flavorful than many other types of meat, and if you order your chicken dish from a steakhouse, there's a good chance it'll be overpriced. If you think you're going with the healthier choice by opting for poultry, think again. Chicken portions served in restaurants are often larger than those of red meat. This eats into whatever calories you saved by eating a leaner protein. No matter how appetizing the dish sounds, chicken is always going to be an afterthought on a steakhouse menu. Not only are you settling for an inferior product, you're missing out on what the establishment does best. Chicken is an extremely common meal. Why waste a trip to the steakhouse on it? There's actually a science behind the idea of pairing red wine with red meat. Red wine generally is higher in tannins, chemicals found in grape skin and berries. While bitter, they work as perfect complements to both protein and fat. Tannin molecules soften the fat found in steak, making it more tender and flavorful. Meanwhile, the more tannin is absorbed by the steak, it reduces the astringency of the wine, making it taste smoother and less bitter. But which red to choose?
And would you care to order wine with your meal?
Hi, yeah. Why don't you bring us a bottle of something or other? Not too sweet, American.
Cabernet Sauvignon is always a good choice for pairing with steak. It has a high level of tannin and a high alcohol content, which will help cut through the meat's fat. And the Cabernet Sauvignon's bold flavors won't be washed away by the powerful flavors of the steak. Generally, the characteristics of red wine and beef complement each other particularly well, but whites can certainly work too. You'll just need to be more particular when you're ordering at a steakhouse. Most white wines will have a subtle flavor that will be washed out by the steak. You'll be paying for a glass of wine that you can't even taste. But if you are going to indulge in a glass of white, the goal will be to find a full-bodied one that mimics the flavors of a red. Chardonnay, Riesling, and Champagne are all good choices. A white wine would work best with a leaner cut of meat, and one that's simply prepared without a heavy sauce. Not every kind of white wine is going to pair well with the steak though, so you'll be wise to avoid those that are too light and lacking in flavor. There are plenty of other beverages that pair well with steak that you can order from a steakhouse. The trick is finding one whose flavors won't be overpowered by the meat. The rich, caramel notes of whiskey fit the bill. Choosing which whiskey pairs best with your steak may be your biggest dilemma. A lot depends on the cut of the steak, how it's prepared, and what other flavors are involved. Bourbon and rye are popular options, but Scotch is often the whiskey choice for grilled steak, as the spirit's smoky flavor complements the flavor from the grill. Whichever you choose, have your whiskey neat, on the rocks, or in a simple cocktail, such as an old-fashioned. This will ensure the true tastes of the whiskey comes through and other flavors don't overpower the meal. Raw oysters are a mainstay on steakhouse menus, and though they may be delectable appetizers, you should think twice before ordering them.
They eat algae, right?
Algae, bacteria. Oysters keeps the water clean.
So we're basically eating water filters.
Yep.
Oysters are a breeding ground for bacteria called Vibrio. Most Vibrio infections cause mild stomach illness, but severe cases can lead to bloodstream infections, severe blistering, and even death. Also important, all the myths you've heard about how to avoid tainted oysters are false. Bacteria aside, oysters can also go bad, just like any other perishable item. Although you can technically keep oysters in your fridge for up to 5 days if they're stored properly, they should be eaten within a few days of being harvested. Ideally within 24 hours if you want the best flavor. The best thing about potatoes is their versatility.
Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew. Lovely big golden chips with a nice piece of fried fish.
Making them such a great side dish. Choose a preparation style that complements your entree, and you'll have yourself a perfect pairing. When it comes to steak, consider mashed potatoes. This comfort food has a creamy texture that goes well with the tender, juicy steak. There's also a much more significant benefit to washing that steak down with potatoes. Red meat consumption has been shown to increase the risk of colon cancer. However, studies have shown that eating red meat along with starch can decrease that risk. Researchers compared individuals who ate red meat alone as well as those who ate red meat and starch and found that the starch reversed some of the damaging effects of red meat on human cells. If you're a voracious carnivore heading to a steakhouse, you're probably shooting past the salad section on the menu. Salads are known to be some of the most overpriced items on any restaurant menu. The ingredients in most salads cost just a few dollars, but an upscale steakhouse can charge north of $15. If you think you're cutting calories by opting for greens, think again. Restaurant salads are often drenched in high-calorie dressings and covered in unhealthy toppings like bacon bits and cheese. Produce also happens to be a hotbed of contamination. According to a 2015 CDC estimate, nearly half of all foodborne illnesses are caused by produce. Meat and poultry caused only 22%. Fish and shellfish, just 6%.